Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome. My name's Alison Stewart and I'm your host of this session of Cut the Crop. And today my guest is Wayne Nichol, who is the National Technical Manager for PGG Wrightson Seeds. And at a recent far and beef and lamb workshop on winter grazing, Wayne was giving a talk, and it was really well received, Wayne. And so we thought we would get you in to have a bit of a chat. So welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So maybe just outline your role at PGG Wrightson Seeds and talk about why you've got the expertise to talk about winter grazing on arable farms.
Yeah, no problem at all. So I'm been with PGG Wrightson Seeds for 25 years and done numerous roles based in agronomy, animal nutrition, that sort of things. Recent returnee back to Christchurch, actually, to be fair, from being down south. So, pretty used to winter feed systems because they're a major part of what we do is talk to farmers and retailers about wintering systems. So, spend a lot of time in that area for sure.
So, I mean, obviously arable farms are quite diverse. And I mean, some arable farms will just have, lambs coming on for winter grazing, but others might have dairy or beef, So let's just talk about what the different types of livestock, what are the feed stocks that arable growers should be looking at?
It's probably not so much feed stocks. I mean, you've got a feed that you'll be growing, whether it be cereals, it'll be ryegrass, it could be fodder beet, could be kale, could be sweet. And all the potential stock classes can be fed those different type of feeds, vast majority of them anyway. But it's just understanding how we feed those feeds and what are the supplements, especially with arable having a lot of byproduct that they can use, just how those feeds marry up to those supplements. So just making sure that we get the feed budgeting in terms of supply and demand correct in terms of not only intake but also nutrient balancing as well, just making sure we're feeding the right diet to the right animal.
Yeah. So let's talk through that. Like I'm an arable grower and I've got lambs coming in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and lambs are probably one of the easier ones. And it depends obviously what crop you're going to put them on and what your objective is. Are you just holding those lambs? A lot of arable guys will be using it for their seed production crops. Until close up. There'll be others that'll be doing specialist crops as well. The good thing about things like grass and cereals, they're relatively easy to feed. They don't take too much work, especially with lambs, other than looking after their, just making sure they're being offered enough and they're looked after in terms of animal health requirements. They're actually relatively easy. It's not too many concerns in terms of animal health other than nitrate poisoning, but it's probably the larger animals that we're probably more concerned about, and especially when we start moving beyond those grass cereal crops into the brassicas and the fodder beet that we tend to have a bit more attention to detail. Okay,
so let's talk about that. What are some of the issues, the challenges then with the larger livestock?
Yeah, and it's, again, it depends on the type of crop. Again, grass and cereals are they're not too bad. It's when we come to the brassicas and fodder beet that things become a little bit more interesting, and especially when it's quite a different feed type to what they're used to what they've come off. So, for example, if you're bringing dairy cows in, for example, they've probably come off pasture and they've probably been transported in as well. And now they're going on to a crop that's substantially different to what they were used to. So there's a naivety issue there for a start, but there's also a rumen adjustment that needs to go on as well so they can cope with that different type of feed. And of course, brassicas and fodder beet, they are quite different in the nutritional profile to what pastures would be. So we have to understand what those differences are and obviously we understand how much feed we've actually got. And then accordingly, how do we offset some of those things that might be deficient in? So for example, fibre, that would be a classic example. Or in the case of growing animals or heavily pregnant animals, we may have to feed a source of protein to offset the protein deficiency that might come with a bulb crop such as sweet and fodder beet because it doesn't have a lot of protein in it. So it's just understanding those. And of course, the most important part of wintering is always the transition phase.
Yeah, I was just about to say, what are the biggest challenges with that transition phase?
Yeah, and it's the change in diet. And we just can't give them ready access to crop. We just can't throw them on and expect them. It's basically, for an arable farm, the closest example I could give, it's like giving a sheep or a cow 100% diet of grain, and we all know they would die from acidosis. Well, it's exactly the same in terms of brassicas and particularly fodder beet, because fodder beet's loaded with soluble sugar. The other one that obviously is a big concern, and most of the phone calls you'll get with an animal health issue would occur within the first 2 or 3 weeks of feeding started, so beginning of June, and the other big one would be nitrate poisoning. So it's understanding that, so we manage that accordingly. So for things like brassica crops, and I go back to, say, a dry dairy cow, most animal classes, we would say it's a 10 to 14 day period with brassicas. So for a dry dairy cow, it might be incremental increase in their diet of the crop that you're feeding of 1 kilo per day up to full intake, which might be 10 to 12 kilos of the crop, or offered 10 to 12 kilos of the crop. And we offset that with pasture and silage. Conversely, with fodder beet, because of its high sugar content, that might be a 21, 23 day window. So we would increase it 1 kilo every 2 days, or for younger stock, it might be half a kilo every 3 days to get them up to maximum intake. So it's giving the rumen a chance to adapt and the animal a chance to adapt to that crop.
Yeah. And so you talk about the size and shape of feed breaks.
Yeah.
You know,
yep.
How on earth does a grower know what to do?
Yeah. And look, and that's about starting with a feed budget. And we should talk about a bit about crop yielding, because you can't, it's the old story. If you don't know, you can't manage what you don't know.
Yeah.
So you need to yield the crops, etc. But in terms of setting it up for feeding, it will depend on how much control of that feeding you want. So for larger animals or higher intake animals, where we want a high degree, we might do daily shifts. Or we need to know how much feed's there and what that animal requires from a feed demand point of view to make sure we're allocating enough feed. And that's just not the feed when we work it out down the throat, but we also have to put an allowance factor in there for utilisation as well. So to ensure that to happen, we need to have the paddock set up so that all animals get equal access, for example. So long, narrow breaks are preferable over short, fat breaks, so all animals can get access to that daily break all the time, so they're not fighting each other to get to the break. Double fencing to protect against breakouts, back fencing to protect them, all those things are part of the planning process to understand, but it starts with actually understanding what you're feeding first, and that's both understanding how much crop you're feeding, but also the supplement you're feeding as well, in terms of how much yield of both of them that you do have.
So where is all this information available?
That's a really good question. So plenty of sites, actually. And look, I've been doing the same talk for a bit. In fact, I was talking to Charlotte Westwood, who's my offsider, and we were saying yesterday that we've been doing this for 20 odd years and it actually hasn't changed much. Beef and lamb, dairy and Z, both have very good places to go to for not only understanding animal requirements, but also understanding how to measure crops. Us as a seed merchant, we put out books that are full of information in there in terms of how to yield crops, feeding practices, etc. And your local retailer, especially their field staff, most of them are fully trained to actually understand how to yield crops and give you some good background information, and can certainly point you in the right direction to get more information. So there's plenty of sources to get in.
Yeah. So what are probably the biggest mistakes that people might make?
Yeah, probably during the transition. And unfortunately, it's a fairly negative outcome. It's dead animals. It's fairly serious. It's nitrate and acidosis, not getting that feeding correct. And there is actually a warning time. As I said, that period about a week after they start is when you'll get the most phone calls. And part of that is we offer them a set amount of feed every day. So we give them their daily ration if they're on break feeding. But what people tend to forget is it takes them a while to get used to the crop, and conditions change. So for bulb crops, for example, we know, particularly like Swedes, we need a good frost. So we know if we get a good frost, they're more acceptable to eat. It's just like us, we find Swedes more easily eatable after a good frost. It's the same. So all that residue material that we left that we didn't eat the first 7 days, we've given them their daily allowance, but what they actually can do is go back and increase their intake on that residue material. Mm-hmm. They've just gone over and above what they should be getting allocated, and that's generally when you find things go a little bit wrong. So the transition phase, or setting up, planning is the most important thing to do right now, but setting up is during the transition phase, and getting transitioning right is probably the most riskiest part. And once we get into winter, well, things settle down.
And so what would be the best options, as in the best crop options?
Yeah, again, it's and cropping farmers are unique in that they've got set programs that they have to do, and they've got set rotations because of isolation distances, and they're a the type of ryegrass that they have to grow, whether it's annual versus perennial. So that's defined. The crop is the crop. It's understanding what that crop is, and then marrying up the supplement that might go with it. And as I said, it's just making sure that, particularly with like dairy cows, for example, or cattle, or young growing stock, that it's not only their energy demands are being met, but in that case, it might be protein demands too. So most arable farmers would have cereal straw available or ryegrass straw available, but that's not a protein source. Yeah. So if they are protein deficient, especially late winter when crops can lose leaf, then you'll have to have a backup plan of putting some protein in there, and that might be lucerne silage or grass silage. So the further south you go, grass baleage becomes more important, but up here it tends to rely on the byproduct coming out of the arable side of the business.
So do you think that it's going to become more and more common?
In terms of winter?
Yeah, across the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, this, because it's evolving. And part of it is because of the intensive winter grazing rules that are being applied. And as I say, there is some changes going on, maybe not so much in arable. It is what it is in arable. Although interesting came out of that one we had in Rakaia the other day, was a lot of them were looking back to dairy grazing as part of their business, which is an interesting move back because there was a bit of a move away. But we're seeing, especially like sort of in the southern environment, they're moving potentially away from winter crops and looking at alternative systems on grass-based, silage-based, but that comes with its own challenges as well. It just doesn't mean that you change some of the issues around soil damage. But yeah, across the country with the IDWG, there is a lot more focus on how we do winter animals for sure.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of arable growers went away from the dairy grazing because of the damage it was doing.
Yeah.
And so it is interesting that they're considering going back.
Yeah, and I guess that's partly to do with cash flow.
I was just going to say, I think it comes back to...
It's a given. But and we, as I said, came back from down south. We saw it down south that wintering creates its own issues. Compaction would be a classic case. You've got a lot of animals confined in a small space. We're probably actually getting better at growing even higher yielding crops than we have in the past. Fodder beet introduced it, and we've now got some of the brassicas that are approaching quite high tonnages, which means we're increasing the carrying capacity on those paddocks. So the fundamental reasons why we might have moved away, we still got to understand why we moved away and have to address those issues, whatever they might be. Yes, it's cash flow, but there's some other things to think about as well.
I know it's hard though to consider the other things when the economics is such an important component of whether you can continue your farm business at the moment. And
I guess another part of that too is we now have to understand that there is a consenting process that we have to go through. And we can't just suddenly decide to wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going to do winter grazing if I haven't done it in the past, because you're going to have to go through a consenting process to allow that to happen. So there's a lot of challenges that perhaps weren't there the last time you did it, but they will be there now.
So with the workshops that FAR and Beef and Lamb have been doing, what have been the most common questions that you've been asked?
Probably only done one for FAR, but it's the same. When you talk about winter grazing, it's exactly what we've talked about. What is the process that you need to go through? It's one of those things we put a lot of effort into growing the crops, and then we get to this time of year, April, May, and we go, oh, now I've got to feed it. And we sort of jump into the wintering rather than having a bit of a plan before we actually do it and just think about all the things that we need to think about, consents. Right now, you should be thinking about doing a quick feed plan, quick feed budget, work out what your demand is, what your supply is. But then there's a whole raft of other things too. Now's a great time to organise things like transport, making sure the consents are in place, organising all your water, your fencing, all those things have to be done. Vets are possibly involved. All those things can be done now. And I think it's a great idea to do it now because it just takes a little bit of stress off when the time comes. You're dealing with a lot of animals moving on to crop. It's easier to do it now while it's a little bit quieter and give yourself a bit of time to.
Yeah, actually, the consenting process is. I mean, how long does that take?
I have no idea. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, because I just know that so many things now are taking so much longer, and And, you just sort of think in the past, you might be able to apply for your consent now and get it in time, but who knows what's happening at the moment, because a lot of the regional councils and things are just so overloaded and under-resourced.
Yeah, but I think it's best to find out, and it's almost a little bit after the event because the crop's in the ground ready to go, but it's best to sort it now rather than get into the middle of winter and suffer the consequences. Find out what you can and can't do, but just be aware you just can't suddenly jump into something if you haven't done it for a long time. Just find out what the process is.
Yeah. So I guess final key messages for our listeners.
Yeah, we've probably covered most of them. Planning, start now.
Yeah.
We're in April now, so start the process, start assessing crops, get things organised, have a plan, start to understand how you are going to go through the winter in terms of your feeding program. The other thing probably worth mentioning is if you have staff that haven't experienced it before, do a bit of training with them as well. Let them know what your expectations are. They may not even be aware of what to look at visually looking at animals. If things are starting to go wrong, what should they be looking for? Is there an animal there that's doesn't want to eat crop or is being bullied and not eating? Well, they're the sort of animals you pick up and say, right, remove them from the paddock. So now's a good time to do training. But other than that, just start the plan now and get things sorted.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And thank you very much, listeners. Have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.